Muy buenas tardes a todos, bienvenidos sean a la cuarta sesión de nuestro Seminario de Discusión Teórica del Departamento de Estudios Internacionales, en la cual tenemos como invitada a la profesora Cristina Edbrooke, que nos va a hablar del tema de British Influence in Argentina, 1880-1945. La novedad de la sesión de hoy es que vamos a iniciar con esta tarde de trabajo los primeros intentos de manejar el seminario en varios idiomas. Por lo tanto, gracias Cristina por proporcionarnos esta oportunidad. Y como Cristina además se está integrando no hace mucho tiempo en el departamento, voy a hacer una presentación un poco más cuidadosa de la que hacemos normalmente, porque bueno, cuando hablamos entre nosotros ya nos conocemos. Cristina Edbrooke es profesora de Contemporary History in Latin America en nuestro departamento. Es licenciada en Estudios Internacionales de la Universidad ORT Uruguay de Argentina. Ha completado, por cierto, todos los cursos correspondientes al máster en Historia y Cultura de la Arquitectura, también en la de Itela. La profesora ha sido profesora asistente de Historia Internacional, Económica Internacional e Historia Contemporánea de Occidente, también en la Universidad de Itela. Allí recibió, por cierto, el premio a la mejor docente asistente de esa institución. Se ha repartido un documento que obviamente servirá de base para referencia de la intervención de la profesora Edbrooke. Y yo creo que para no hacer esto demasiado largo y no ocupar demasiado tiempo con la presentación, le dejaríamos la palabra a la profesora Edbrooke y a Cristina con el mayor de los placeres. Gracias.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. And so today's presentation is going to be on the British influence in Argentina. Since colonial times, all the way through the middle of the 20th century, the British have had a dominant position in what is today Argentina. And the aim of the presentation today is to present an overview of its influence, but from a political economy perspective. So the British influenced Argentina in many ways. We could analyze it culturally, socially, ideologically, but our focus today is going to be mainly on the political, economic side of this relationship. And the period we're going to focus on spans from 1880 till 1948. Okay, so just to outline what we're going to be looking at, in order to provide a background to the relations between these two countries, I'm going to first touch on Great Britain's economic relations with the River Plate region during the colonial period and how these relations strengthened once Argentina declared its independence from Spain. Next, and this will be a central part of the presentation, we're going to analyze a bit more in detail Britain's influence in Argentina between 1880 and the First World War, because this is the crucial period in Argentina's economic history where the country finally consolidated itself as a nation state and chose to insert itself into the world economy, complementing Britain's economic position. So again, this period 1880 to the First World War is crucial to understand the importance of Britain's influence in Argentina's history and especially political economy. And finally, towards the end of the presentation, we're going to run through the years after the First World War up to the end of the Second World War, which is basically when we are going to see a change in Britain's influence in this part of Latin America. The First World War is a breaking point in the relationship. Things are going to change after it. Not dramatically, not from one day to the next, but things aren't going to be the same after the First World War in terms of Britain's influence in Argentina. And of course, my presentation is going to finish in 1948, which is a crucial date that basically closes this chapter of the long-standing influence Britain has in Argentina, when Perón decides to nationalize the railway system in Argentina and basically also taking away Britain's last true stronghold in the country. Okay, so after this brief outline, I'll jump right into it then. So just to give you a bit of a background of the influence Britain had in what today is Argentina, it all started during the colonial period. What is the area, the southernmost area of South America, what is today Argentina, was part of the Spanish Empire, and for most of its existence was a very remote and unimportant and non-important part of the Spanish Empire. This part of Latin America didn't have any silver or gold. We didn't have a large Indian population to enslave, and later on in time, when plantation economies were going to take over as a very important part of any empire's economy, it turns out that we don't have the climatic conditions for plantation economies either. So what is today Argentina, and especially the River Plate region, was during most of Spain's imperial history a very remote and forgotten part of its empire. Now, having said that, we have to also remember that Spain, during most of its colonial history, had the mercantilist ideology very much in mind. What this meant was that its empire was organized in such a way to benefit the local economy in Spain, and one way of doing this was to make sure that trade was monopolized between the colonies and the metropolis. So basically, everything that came to this part of South America had to come on British ships. It had to leave ports in Spain, and these convoys would arrive very, very sporadically, and of course never bringing enough goods for the locals. So who was there to complement and to take advantage of this lack of Spanish economic presence in the River Plate region? Britain. So from very early in our history, we have had a history with Britain, albeit a kind of illegal trade history, and that is going to define the influence England has on this part of South America until Argentina declares its independence from Spain in 1860. So Britain was present in this part of the Spanish Empire with illegal trade, with contraband trade. And there was even an attempt to physically take over this part of the Spanish Empire in 1806 and 1807, which of course all of us know it failed. these British invasions failed, thanks to the locals' defense of the city of Buenos Aires, which in 1776 had been declared the capital of a new viceroyalty, the Viceroyalty of the River Plate, that Spain decided to create, very much keeping in mind that Britain was looking towards South America for potential colonies. There were interest groups in Britain that were pressuring for the acquisition of colonies in Spanish America, and these two attempts in 1806 and 1807 did not bear their fruits, but many people forget that the Union Jack actually flew on the fort of Buenos Aires for a number of weeks. And I believe many people in Britain don't know this part of their history, their imperial history. So after the British unsuccessfully tried to establish a colony in the River Plate, they immediately realized that the second best option, and even maybe the best option, was to encourage Argentina's independence from Spain. So once we declared our independence from Spain in 1816, the first European power to recognize Argentina as an independent country was Britain, and basically in return for Argentina guaranteeing commercial privileges with Britain, okay? So once this newly independent country also slowly started to get its, to try to act like a country, Britain was also the first to offer loans to the government. And unfortunately, almost from the beginning, Argentina was going to have a lot of trouble repaying these loans. So after the failed attempts of, or these unsuccessful loans in the 1820s, it was going to be some decades would have to pass until Britain renewed its interest in investing in Argentina. And we're going to see how they're going to start to do it with great presence. Okay, so so that's a bit of the history of, or the background to the British presence in Argentina, and we're going to see how this presence and influence is going to increase dramatically in the period that goes from 1880 to the First World War. Now, what is so specific about 1880 in Argentina? Why can we, or why do many historians and economic historians pinpoint this date as the beginning of the Argentine miracle, as it's known? And one of the reasons why the year 1880 is so important is that finally, in this year, many people, most people in Argentina truly believed that the Civil War was over, on the one hand, so the internal strife had come to an end. External threats and wars like the Paraguayan War that we had been fighting in the 1860s was also over, so there were no external threats to Argentina. And finally, what had been a long-standing conflict within the country was settled, and that's when the city of Buenos Aires was taken away from the province of Buenos Aires and turned into the capital of the country. So the city of Buenos Aires was federalized in 1880, and with that, a very sore spot in the civil wars of Argentina was supposedly put to rest. This conflict was put to rest. The city of Buenos Aires was now going to be nationalized. It was going to be the capital of the country. the port of Buenos Aires and all the money coming in from the taxes and was going to go to the nation, to the federal government. And so with this also, Argentina could finally get its act together and start acting like a unified country. So this all started in 1880, and there was a group of men, people behind this movement of finally trying to push Argentina forward and into basically into the world economy, and also trying to push Argentina into progress, a motion that would lead it into the future, into a very bright future. And this group of men, which are known as the generation of the 80s, had many things in common that led Argentina, or that allowed Argentina to have an economic plan into the future. And the values that these politicians, businessmen, landowners, journalists, the values that all these men kind of shared was that was basically Argentina had to insert itself into the world economy. Argentina was going to do so by complementing the #1 economic power of the time, Britain, because Argentina had the resource dotation, the factor endowment to complement Great Britain's economy. Great Britain was the #1 exporter of manufactures, and at the time needed to import raw material and food. Argentina had the perfect factor endowment to play the role that Britain needed it to play as a supplier of raw materials and food. And on the other hand, so the ruling class of Argentina at the time recognized that this was the best way for Argentina to move forward. And also there were a number of ideological factors which also contributed to Argentina inserting itself in the world economy this way. And to name a few, we have this idea of indefinite progress that comes from Spencer. We've got social Darwinism, which was also rather popular amongst this group of men, and also Comte's positivism. No? So all this, basically all these ideas basically encouraged the ruling class of Argentina to push Argentina into the world economy at whatever price, no? Without really repairing in maybe the social costs that would come with it and that they would have to deal with further on. So Argentina in the 1880 finds itself in a world context where Great Britain, as I mentioned, is the superpower, and we have a world economy that is highly integrated. Capital movements flow freely around the world, goods flow relatively freely around the world also, and towards the 1880s, the world is going through basically a growth in production. Okay, so all these context factors play positively into Argentina's new role in this world economy. And also it's important to also stress that Britain was the #1 player in this world economy, not only because of its wealth. If you look at it objectively, Britain was the wealthiest country at the time, but also its economic organization was such that they, of course, promoted the international division of labor and specialization. So, and that's where Argentina also basically embraced these principles and willingly specialized in what, at least in this period of time, it was best at, which was an exporter of commodities, and would import what it was not good at, which was basically the manufacturing of goods. So this is where Argentina stands in 1880. In this world context, this world economic context that is dominated by the Pax Britannica, and Argentina finds itself with a specific factor endowment that will determine or will set the stage for Britain's strong influence in its economy. So if we look at Argentina in the 1880s and look at its factors of production, and this is how I'll organize the next our analysis of the British influence in Argentina between 1880 and the First World War. Looking at Argentina's factors of production, we have a new country which has plenty of land. It's plenty of extremely fertile land. It's land that seems to be limitless, because we have to remember that the Argentine frontier, just like the American frontier was moved west in the mid-1800s, or the Argentine frontier was also moved south and southwest as during the second half of the 1800s also. So we had plenty of what seemed, at first it didn't really seem to be fertile land, but later on they were going to realize that it was enough, that and parts of it were actually going to be very good for the exports that we were going to produce. But so we had plenty of land. One thing that we had to do was to make this land available, in a sense, to the world economy. And how could you make this land available? By shortening the distances between it and the ports. And one of the ways that we were going to shorten this distance was to basically rule or develop a network of railway systems, a network of railways that was going to be grow exponentially during this period between 1880 and the First World War. So the country needed to get these fertile, at first sheep producing, and later on wheat and producing lands closer to the ports. And to do so, we were going to have to spread out the railway system. And who was going to do that for Argentina but the British? So the British influence in Argentina from the beginning of really the beginning of the 1860s was very present in this capital investment in railways. Just to give you an idea of how important the railways were going to be for the Argentine economy and how important the British presence was going to be in the expansion of the railway system in Argentina. In 1865, there were 250 kilometers of railways in Argentina. By 1914, there were 35,000 kilometers of railways in Argentina. And this basically was organized from the ports of Buenos Aires into the country, because since their inception, the idea was to bring the raw materials from the different points of Argentina to the ports so that they could be shipped out to Europe and specifically to Britain from the ports on the Atlantic. So Argentina realized that it needed these railways. The government didn't have money, and the British were very willing to invest in the railways, in part because the government of Argentina gave them such beneficial concessions. One of the things they did so as to attract investment in railways was to give the British or the companies who built the lines a league of land on either side of the tracks, and on the other hand, they could import all the capital investment or all that they needed without paying taxes. They could also, and they were also guaranteed a 7% return on their investment. So all this meant that the British at first were very eager to invest in the railways in Argentina, and the system expanded all over, mainly towards the Pampas, which is where the cattle and the agricultural and the very fertile agricultural land were going to be, but then also towards the rest of the country, bringing in wood from the north, wool from the south, and other commodities from other regions of Argentina. So not only did the British invest in the railways in this period of the 1880s to the First World War, but they also heavily invested in social capital. So Argentina was a growing country that had growing cities, and the British were going to be the #1 investor in the development of the waterworks, networks, the sewage systems. The tramways of Buenos Aires were in the hands, actually towards the First World War, were in the hands of one a British company that owned basically the most extensive tramway system of the world. Buenos Aires had a very, very close-knit tramway system towards the First World War, and the British owned 85% of it. The British were also going to be present in building ports in Argentina. They were going to be present with their banks, with their insurance companies, with the transport companies. So all this meant that all this type of investment, both portfolio and foreign direct investment, meant that the British, and not only, and the British commoner had a very large stake in Argentina's future. Okay, so what happened in Argentina was important for the British, and funnily enough, the factor of production that the British were least present in were people. So we talked about how Argentina had plenty of land, it needed capital, and the British would give it to them, but Argentina was also needing immigration, and that's where the British did not send people over, like it would to other parts of the British Empire, such as Australia, New Zealand, or Canada. So, in terms of people, at the beginning of the 1880s, the government of Argentina actively promoted the immigration process. And although before this time, the government of Argentina had tried to attract immigration from Europe and from the north of Europe, it wasn't successful. So when it inserted itself in the world economy in the 1880s and needed people to work in Argentina, it ended up receiving Mediterranean immigration. So, so the great majority of the immigrants in Argentina came from Italy, followed by Spain, and to a much lesser extent from other countries such as France, Belgium, Russia, Germany. And the British were only going to represent 4% of the population of Argentina at its peak. So the British, as a factor of production in terms of labor, were not important, but they were truly important in the capital side of the equation. So Argentina goes through ups and downs in this period between 1880 and 1914. It grows during the 1880s. This is interrupted in 1890 when an economic crisis hits, and actually a world economic crisis takes place in great respect thanks to the lack of or the inability of Argentina to pay its loans to the Baring Brothers Company. And it's going to be a while after 1890 until Argentina gets back on its feet, recovers capital investment from Britain, and will grow steadily to basically its peak towards 1910, which is when Argentina is celebrating the centenary of the May Revolution of 1810. So we find ourselves, or Argentina finds itself, on the brink of the First World War with an economy that is truly inserted in the global markets, and we're inserting ourselves with the export now mainly or almost 50-50 of the exports of cereal and of meat, chilled beef. But we're going to see how things are going to change with the First World War. When the First World War breaks out, Argentina is going to be deeply affected, mainly because Britain, as we all know, loses its prominent position in the world economy. It is devastated by the First World War, and the United States is slowly going to take its place as the dominant power, economic power, in Latin America. Now, even though the United States had been present in the economic spheres of Central America and the Caribbean, the British did manage to hold on to its influence in the south of, in South America, but the First World War is going to put an end to this. And this is where economic historians pinpoint or some economic historians pinpoint the beginning of Argentina's slow fall into disgrace. And some of them will explain that a great problem Argentina had was it didn't recognize that the United States, or it didn't want to accept the fact that now the United States was going to be the economic power with whom one should associate with. And we kept on clinging to Great Britain, even though it was no longer the partner to have. So after the First World War, things started to change in the relationship between Argentina and Britain. British investment in Argentina was slowly going to shrink, and we were going to start to see American investment in Argentina, and specifically in the industrial sectors of the Argentine economy. It's in the 1920s when, a bit thanks to the First World War, that the economic flows had stopped because of the First World War, that the national economies and the national industries in Argentina got a small boost and were allowed to develop in a protected environment. We're going to see how in the 1920s this growth in Argentine industry is going to carry on, but still Argentina didn't dramatically change its role as a commodity producer. However, the industry that does develop in Argentina in the 1920s is going to see a strong presence on the part of the United States. This is when American car companies are going to establish themselves in Argentina. It's when American meatpacking companies are also going to be present. And so slowly we're going to see how the tables are turning, and Britain, that had been the #1 by far foreign investor in Argentina, is slowly going to lose ground to England. And the Great Depression is going to be a further event, another event that is going to shake the British influence in Argentina. Because with the Great Depression, as we all know, the European economies started putting up trade barriers, as did the United States, and as did Argentina. Our fiscal balance was in dire straits, so we also put up tariffs. But the truth is that Argentina was going to realize, was going to get a bit of a slap in the face when, during the Great Depression in the early 1930s, Britain, at the Conference of Ottawa in 1931-32, is going to openly favor its colonies, its colonial products to Argentine products. So Argentina, that had always benefited from having this market available to it, and basically concentrating all its export products towards Britain, now found that Britain had built a wall and was favoring the Commonwealth and the colonies. So Argentina has nowhere to place its exports, is needing foreign exchange to be able to import the basic consumer goods that we needed and the capital goods that we needed, and is going to do or take a step that many will consider to be one of the most a very polemic decision in Argentina's economic history. And this is, it's going to, in the 1930s, to sign an agreement with Britain, which is known as the Roca-Runciman Agreement. And basically what Argentina is going to do is going to lower its head, and to be able to export its meat to the British market in the context of the Great Depression, to be able to do that, it will have to accept very, very detrimental trade conditions in return. So we're seeing how the relationship between Britain and Argentina is very strained in the 1930s. And just to finish off, and this really should be a matter for an entirely different presentation, the relationship and the influence Britain has in Argentina again is going to be dramatically altered in the 1940s when Perón comes to power. And Britain's investments in Argentina had slowly been dropping. The imports and exports had, towards the 1940s, grown again, but Perón, in this very nationalist and very how shall we put it? This, yes, populist. This populist, yes, thank you, behavior is in 1947 going to nationalize the British railways. And it's interesting to point out how already towards in the 1930s, the British had recognized that once they had lost the railways in Argentina, they had lost everything. No, it was time to move out, sort of thing. So Perón will close this chapter in this relationship, this long-standing relationship that Britain had with Argentina, and it would never be the same since. So, thank you very much.